Today, we are going to explore one of the most transformative inventions in human history, an object so present in our daily lives that we rarely stop to reflect on its extraordinary journey through the centuries. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine for a moment a world where aging inevitably meant losing the ability to see, a world where vision that deteriorated with the passing years was simply accepted as an irrevocable sentence, a fate from which no one could escape. This was the scenario that unfolded in Europe during the Middle Ages, particularly throughout the 13th century, when men and women of all social conditions faced the same relentless reality. The gradual loss of vision was not just an inconvenience, it was a condemnation that transformed productive individuals into dependent beings, forced to abandon their occupations, their studies, and ultimately, their active participation in society. At that time, the deterioration of vision was considered as natural as the whitening of hair or the wrinkling of skin. When a craftsman began to have difficulty distinguishing the minute details of his work, when a scribe could no longer decipher the letters of the manuscripts he copied, when a merchant no longer recognized the coins in his hands, there was no recourse. Progressive blindness was simply accepted as an inexorable part of the cycle of life. Trades that depended on visual acuity were abandoned, and those who had spent decades perfecting their skills suddenly found themselves unable to practice their professions. A goldsmith who had dedicated his entire youth to learning the secrets of goldsmithing had to, upon reaching middle age, hand over his tools to younger hands. A manuscript illuminator, whose eyes had created the most beautiful images to adorn sacred texts, found himself forced to abandon brushes and pigments when his vision began to fail. The situation was particularly dramatic in the monasteries scattered across medieval Europe. In these centers of knowledge and spirituality, reading and writing constituted fundamental activities of monastic life. The monks dedicated long hours to studying the scriptures, copying ancient texts, and producing illuminated manuscripts that would preserve knowledge for future generations. The scriptorium, the place where the copyist monks performed their meticulous work, was the intellectual heart of any respectable monastery. There, hunched over their parchments, the religious men transcribed word for word the texts that had survived since antiquity, ensuring that the wisdom of the ancients was not lost in the mists of time. However, this noble task required sharp eyes and steady hands. The elaborate calligraphy, the intricate details of the illuminations, the tiny letters that filled line after line of the valuable parchments, all of this demanded impeccable vision. When the years began to take their toll and the monks' eyes could no longer distinguish the characters with the same precision as before, these devoted men found themselves removed from what was, often, the reason for their existence. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided life in countless European monasteries, established that monks should dedicate themselves to both prayer and work, following the principle of ora et labora. For many religious individuals, the intellectual work of copying and studying sacred texts represented the highest form of serving God. Losing the ability to perform this task was, therefore, a devastating blow not only to the monastery's productivity, but to the monk's own spiritual identity. This reality, however, was about to change. Far from European lands, in the vast expanses of the Islamic world, a man of extraordinary intelligence had laid the theoretical foundations for a revolution that would forever transform humanity's relationship with vision. Abu Ali al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as al-Hazen or al-Hachen, was born around the year 965 in Basra, in present-day Iraq. This polymath dedicated his life to the study of mathematics, astronomy, and, above all, optics, a field in which he would make contributions that would echo through the centuries. The Book of Optics, his most influential work, represented a fundamental break with the theories of vision that had predominated since antiquity. While Greek thinkers like Plato and Euclid had argued that vision occurred through rays emanating from the eyes toward the observed objects, Ibn al-Haytham demonstrated that light traveled from objects to the eyes, and not the other way around. This seemingly simple inversion was, in fact, a conceptual revolution that would pave the way for all of modern optics. Even more importantly for our narrative, Ibn al-Haytham was the first to suggest that pieces of carefully polished glass could be used to assist people with visual impairments. He described how segments of a glass sphere could magnify images when positioned over texts, allowing small letters to be seen with greater clarity. This idea remained in the theoretical field for many decades, awaiting the moment when it would find skilled hands capable of transforming it into reality. The Book of Optics was translated into Latin in 1240, and its arrival in Europe coincided with a period of intense intellectual activity in the continent's monasteries. The monks, always eager for knowledge, received Ibn al-Haytham's work with great enthusiasm. Monastic communities, particularly in Italy, began to experiment with the principles described by the Arab sage. It was in this context that the first reading stones appeared, hemispherical lenses made of rock crystal or quartz that, when placed over a text, magnified the letters and facilitated reading. These reading stones represented a significant advance, but they were still far from being a practical solution to vision problems. They had to be held over the text, which occupied one of the reader's hands and made it difficult to simultaneously manipulate books and writing materials. Furthermore, their field of vision was limited, allowing only a small portion of the text to be magnified at a time. However, for the monks who had believed they would never be able to read again, those simple stones of glass represented nothing less than a miracle. Among the European thinkers who delved into the questions of optics, the singular figure of Roger Bacon stands out, an English Franciscan friar born around 1214 in Somerset. Bacon studied at the prestigious universities of Oxford and Paris, where he came into contact with the translated works of Arab scholars. Deeply influenced by Ibn al-Haytham's Book of Optics and the teachings of Robert Grosseteste, his mentor at Oxford, Bacon dedicated a large part of his life to the experimental study of nature. Known as Doctor Mirabilis, the Admirable Doctor, Bacon was a controversial figure in his time. His advanced ideas about the importance of experimentation and empirical observation often clashed with ecclesiastical authorities who viewed with suspicion any knowledge that seemed to challenge established truths. Even so, Bacon persevered in his studies, finding protection at certain times with Pope Clement IV, who admired his erudition and encouraged his research. In 1267, Bacon wrote his most important work, the Opus Majus, a monumental treatise that covered everything from grammar and logic to mathematics, physics, and philosophy. One of the most significant sections of this work was dedicated to optics, in which Bacon demonstrated how segments of polished glass could make small objects appear larger. He explicitly stated that this instrument would be extremely useful for elderly people and for those with weak vision, allowing them to see small letters at a size large enough to be read with ease. Roger Bacon even took a sample of one of these reading lenses to the Pope, personally demonstrating how it could benefit those whose vision was no longer what it once was. This presentation to the Pontiff represented a crucial moment in the history of visual aids, as it conferred religious and intellectual legitimacy upon an instrument that some still viewed with suspicion. If the Pope himself approved the use of such lenses, they certainly could not be considered works of witchcraft or black magic, accusations that frequently fell upon any innovation that seemed to challenge the natural order of things. While scholars debated the theoretical properties of light and refraction, a silent revolution was underway in the glass workshops of northern Italy. In Venice, a city that had established itself as one of the greatest commercial centers of the medieval world, the art of glassmaking had reached unprecedented levels of sophistication. Venetian glassmakers were recognized throughout Europe for the exceptional quality of their products, and the secrets of their art were guarded with the utmost zeal. The history of the island of Murano is closely linked to the history of Venetian glass. In 1291, the government of the Republic of Venice decreed that all glass factories should be moved from the main city to this small island located just over a kilometer away. Officially, the measure aimed to protect Venice from the risk of fires, since glassmaking required extremely high temperatures and most Venetian buildings were made of wood. In reality, however, the transfer had a much more strategic purpose: to confine the glassmakers and their families to a location from which it would be much harder to escape, thus ensuring that the valuable secrets of glass production were not revealed to rival powers. The master glassmakers of Murano, known as Cristalleri, occupied a peculiar position in Venetian society. On one hand, they were practically prisoners on their own island, forbidden from leaving it under penalty of severe punishments that could include imprisonment, forced labor, or even death. On the other hand, they enjoyed extraordinary privileges for artisans of their time. Their families were inscribed in the Golden Book of Murano, conferring upon them an almost noble status. Their daughters could marry members of the Venetian nobility without it representing an unequal alliance. In short, the glassmakers of Murano were luxury prisoners, confined by the importance of their knowledge. It was in this environment of secrecy and sophistication that the techniques were developed that would make it possible to manufacture the first lenses of adequate quality to assist vision. The glassmakers of Murano perfected the production of so-called white glass, an exceptionally clear and colorless glass that was essential for the manufacture of optical instruments. Around 1450, Angelo Barovier, a member of one of the most illustrious families of Murano glassmakers, developed Cristallo, a glass of incomparable transparency and brilliance that further elevated the quality of the lenses produced on the island. The exact moment when someone had the idea of joining two lenses into a single frame to create the first proper spectacles remains shrouded in mystery. There is no single inventor to whom we can attribute this revolutionary creation. Instead, we have a gradual process of experimentation and refinement that unfolded over several decades. Some historians point to the city of Florence as the birthplace of this invention, others to Pisa or to Venice itself. What we know for certain is that, around 1286, the first rivet spectacles, as they were called, began to appear in northern Italy. These early spectacles consisted of two convex lenses mounted in rims of wood, horn, metal, or leather, joined by a central rivet or pin. To use them, the wearer had to hold them with their hand in front of their eyes or balance them precariously on the nose, as no fastening system had yet been developed to keep them in place without manual support. Despite this obvious limitation, rivet spectacles represented an extraordinary advance. For the first time in history, people with presbyopia, the condition that makes near vision difficult and which inevitably affects practically every individual after age 40, could return to reading, writing, and performing detailed work. A particularly significant document for the history of spectacles is a sermon delivered in 1306 by the Dominican friar Giordano de Pisa. In this sermon, Giordano declared that not yet 20 years had passed since the discovery of the way to manufacture glass lenses that allowed for a good vision of things. This statement places the invention of spectacles around 1286, corroborating other evidence pointing to this period. Giordano also mentioned that he had personally known the inventor, although he did not reveal his name, thus adding another element of mystery to this story already full of uncertainties. Among the oldest and most important visual evidences of the existence of spectacles in the Middle Ages are the frescoes painted by Tommaso da Modena in the chapter house of the former Dominican convent of San Niccolò in Treviso. In 1352, this talented Emilian artist was hired to decorate the room with portraits of 40 illustrious Dominicans, including popes, cardinals, theologians, and philosophers. What makes these frescoes exceptional is not just their artistic quality, but the fact that Tommaso portrayed his characters not in solemn and idealized poses, but engaged in their daily activities of study and writing. In one of these frescoes, we see Cardinal Ugo de Provenza, also known as Hugh of Saint-Cher, a Dominican theologian who lived between approximately 1200 and 1263. The cardinal is portrayed wearing a pair of rivet spectacles while reading a manuscript. This is considered the first known portrait of a person wearing spectacles in a work of art. The fact that Tommaso included this detail suggests that, by 1352, spectacles were already common enough that their representation caused no surprise, even if the character portrayed had lived a century earlier, at a time when spectacles did not yet exist. The cost of the first spectacles was prohibitive for the vast majority of the medieval population. Lenses of rock crystal or Murano glass required extremely specialized work to be polished with the correct curvature, and the frames, even the simplest ones, demanded materials and artisanal skills that were not within reach of just any workshop. There are historical records that, in China during the Ming dynasty, between 1260 and 1368, a wealthy gentleman exchanged a pair of fine, thoroughbred horses for a single pair of spectacles, giving an idea of the extraordinary value attributed to these objects. In medieval Europe, spectacles were unmistakable symbols of erudition, wealth, and social status. Wearing spectacles meant, first and foremost, that their wearer knew how to read, a skill still restricted to a small elite of clerics, nobles, and prosperous merchants. It also meant that he could afford to own an object of value equivalent to that of a house or property. For these reasons, spectacles often became associated with figures of authority and wisdom. In religious paintings of the time, saints and doctors of the church began to be portrayed wearing spectacles, conferring upon the object an aura of sanctity and knowledge. However, not everyone viewed spectacles favorably. In an era dominated by religious thought and suspicion toward anything that seemed to alter the natural order established by God, some questioned whether it was appropriate to use devices to correct what Providence had decreed. If God wanted a man to continue seeing in old age, he would not have allowed his vision to deteriorate. Therefore, wouldn't wearing spectacles be a way of defying the divine will? These questions, though present, were not enough to stop the spread of spectacles throughout Europe. The demand for visual aid instruments was simply too great to be contained by theological objections. Monks who had resigned themselves to never copying manuscripts again discovered they could resume their activities. Merchants who could no longer check their account books went back to managing their businesses. Artisans of all specialties extended their careers by years or decades beyond what would have been possible without the aid of corrective lenses. As the decades passed, spectacle makers sought solutions for the most obvious problem of their products, the need to hold them by hand or balance them on the nose. Around the 15th century, models began to appear that used ribbons or leather straps that fastened around the head, keeping the spectacles in place without requiring the use of hands. This solution, while representing an advance in terms of practicality, brought its own inconveniences. The straps often squeezed too tightly, causing headaches and marks on the skin. Furthermore, they were aesthetically unpleasant and made it difficult to wear hats or other head ornaments. Other models experimented with different forms of attachment. Some spectacles came with a side rod that the user could hold, freeing at least one hand. Others had clips that attached to hats or caps. There were even models mounted on wire structures that rested on the forehead. Each of these solutions presented advantages and disadvantages, and none of them managed to definitively solve the problem of comfort and practicality. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 radically transformed the spectacle market. Before the press, books were copied by hand, one by one, in a laborious process that severely limited their availability. Reading was an activity restricted to a small elite of the literate. With mass printing, books became more accessible, and literacy began to expand to broader layers of the population. And with more people reading, naturally, the demand for instruments to assist vision also grew. Spectacle makers, who until then had been isolated artisans working for a restricted clientele, began to organize themselves into guilds, establishing quality standards and training apprentices. In various European cities, entire streets and neighborhoods emerged dedicated to the manufacture and sale of spectacles. Nuremberg and Augsburg in Germany, Rouen and Flanders in France, and naturally Venice and other Italian cities became recognized centers of optical production. The diffusion of spectacles brought with it an interesting social phenomenon. In many places in Europe, people sought to avoid being seen wearing spectacles in public, as it would reveal the loss of their visual faculties, something considered shameful or a sign of old age. Spectacles were often kept in cases and used only in private settings. On the other hand, in certain contexts, spectacles came to be seen as positive symbols. Paintings of the time show figures of authority, such as judges, doctors, and professors, sporting spectacles as emblems of their wisdom and erudition. In some cases, people with perfectly normal vision even wore spectacles without lenses, just to appear more cultured and respectable. This ambivalence toward spectacles, sometimes hidden as a sign of weakness, other times displayed as a status symbol, would persist for centuries. A particularly important development occurred when spectacle makers discovered how to produce concave lenses to correct myopia, the condition that makes distance vision difficult. Until then, spectacles had been exclusively equipped with convex lenses, suitable for correcting presbyopia and hyperopia. The first records of the use of lenses for myopia date back to the mid-15th century, significantly expanding the scope of benefits provided by spectacles. The centuries that followed would witness continuous advances in spectacle technology. In 1727, the English optician Edward Scarlett popularized the design with rigid temples that rested over the ears, finally eliminating the need to hold the spectacles with the hands or fasten them with uncomfortable straps. This seemingly simple innovation represented a fundamental transformation in the usability of spectacles, making them much more practical for daily use. In 1784, Benjamin Franklin, the celebrated American statesman and inventor, developed the first bifocal lenses. Franklin was nearsighted, and as he aged, he also developed presbyopia, which forced him to constantly switch between two different pairs of spectacles. His ingenious solution was to split the lenses horizontally, placing the distance correction in the upper part and the near correction in the lower part. With this, he could see both distant objects and nearby texts clearly without needing to change spectacles. The lenses of early spectacles were made of thick and heavy glass, which caused considerable discomfort for those who needed to wear them for prolonged periods. Furthermore, optical quality was often irregular, with distortions and imperfections that could cause headaches and even worsen vision instead of improving it. Only with the development of more advanced polishing techniques and the introduction of new materials did these problems begin to be overcome. In the 20th century, the introduction of plastic lenses represented another significant milestone. Much lighter than glass, they made wearing spectacles significantly more comfortable. The following decades, special coatings emerged that reduced light reflection and increased scratch resistance, further improving the wearing experience. Today, spectacles are much more than simple visual correction instruments. They have become fashion accessories, expressions of personality and style. Progressive lenses and digital technologies allow for the manufacture of personalized lenses with millimeter precision. And yet, as sophisticated as modern spectacles are, they keep at their core the same principle that allowed a medieval monk more than 7 centuries ago to return to reading the pages of a precious manuscript. When we place a pair of spectacles on our nose, we are participating in a tradition that dates back to the workshops of Murano, to the scriptoria of Italian monasteries, to the pages of Ibn al-Haytham's Book of Optics. We are connecting with generations of artisans, scholars, and inventors who, each in their own way, contributed so that we could see the world with clarity. The history of spectacles is, ultimately, a story of human hope and perseverance. In a time when science was often viewed with suspicion, brave men dared to question, investigate, and create. They refused to accept that loss of vision was a final sentence, and by doing so, they transformed not only how we see the world, but also how we participate in it. Millions of people who would have been condemned to functional blindness were able to continue, working, studying, and creating. Artists whose eyes no longer distinguished colors continued to paint. Writers whose vision had failed continued to produce texts that would inspire generations. The invention of spectacles was not just a technological advance, it was an expansion of human possibilities. And so we reach the end of this journey through the centuries, from the reading stones of medieval monasteries to the sophisticated optical instruments of our day. A journey that showed us how a simple idea transformed into one of the most important inventions in the history of civilization. A journey that reminded us that human progress occurs through the patient work of countless individuals who contributed, each with their own small piece, to the great mosaic of knowledge. If this narrative touched you in some way, if it awakened your curiosity about the past or your gratitude for the technologies we consider trivial today, we invite you to be part of our community. Subscribe to the channel to follow more fascinating stories like this one. Leave your comments sharing your reflections or saying what you would like to see explored in our next documentaries. And if you believe others would also like to know this story, do not hesitate to like and share this video. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time, and until the next documentary.